Hey, it's Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. Now, I was looking for fun ways to tell you that Mint's offer of unlimited premium wireless for $15 a month is back. So I thought it would be fun if we made $15 bills. But it turns out that's very illegal. So there goes my big idea for the commercial. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. New customer offer for first 3 months only. Speed slow after 35 gigabytes if network's busy. Taxes and fees extra. See mintmobile.com.
My cat Freddie loves to be brushed and cuddled. But stirring up his cat allergens meant sneezing and itchy eyes. Then I found Purina One Live Clear. It's cat food that reduced the major allergen and my suffering in as little as 21 days. Now, we feel closer than ever. If you have issues with cat allergens, you really need to try Purina One Live Clear.
Try new Purina One Live Clear today. Purina One, a difference from day one.
Atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy.
Hello, and welcome to The Politics Guys. This is our special midweek bonus episode. If you found yourselves here, you probably know the story, but we are the home of rational, bipartisan, collegial, political discussion, etc. And gosh, there is so much to fit in any given week that we really need to do 2 whole shows every week. So anyhow, this brings us to today. And thank you for joining us. Those of you that are subscribers, thanks for being subscribers. Those of you that are getting the 15-minute sample, go to the show notes and find out how to subscribe. With that, today I am joined by conservative lawyer Joey Ashbrook. How you doing today, Joey?
Doing great, Justin. Great to be with you.
Hey, it's great to be with you too. It's always a pleasure talking to you. So we've got sort of about 3 topics I think that we're going to hit for today. And how about you take it away? You've got the intro on the first couple of them.
I would love to, Justin. This first one is one that I have been really curious and looking forward to getting your take on, and it is the current state of the Democratic Party. In some recent news, as everyone knows, the Democratic Party in New York City nominated an unashamed socialist for the party nomination, and Mr. Mondami is still polling very strong in that race. And just last week, Hunter Biden gave a quite unvarnished interview that went viral where he threw some punches along old fault lines at folks like Rahm Emanuel, et cetera. And Joe Rogan said last week in talking about Hunter Biden that he wouldn't be surprised if Hunter Biden someday was president of the United States, which I think just underscores how wide open the political world is. And it got me thinking about right now, in the era of Trump, how things have changed and what's possible. And it got me thinking about even the midterms, but the Democratic primary for president in 2028 and just how wide open it is. And I'm curious as to, it seems like from this Republican's perspective, it seems like the Democratic Party is in disarray right now and is, as often happens after a big loss, has some fighting going on amongst itself, but it's also struggling in the vacuum to determine where's it going to go forward from a messaging and who's the messenger going to be. And I'm curious if you think you have any view on how that's going to shake out and where we're headed and how that's going to affect folks jockeying to get the nomination in 2028.
Ooh, shake out. That's the harder part. I agree with a lot of what you said in terms of, Democrats and some degree of disarray and what have you. As Will Rogers once said, I'm not a member of any organized political party. I'm a Democrat. Gosh, that was sometime in the 1930s, I think. So, I think knowing where we're headed is a little tough. And, I think I and a lot of people have some problems with sort of the institutional Democratic Party. And, I think you're right. I mean, every party, when we come to the assessment of things after a loss, ends up being a bit of a crossroads. And Republicans were in this position in 2008 and 2012, where, there is sort of a fight over, what do we want to be? And if you go back to kind of that old rift, I promise I'll come back to the Democrats, but it's a similar sort of rift. I haven't used it in a while because they're a little long in the tooth, but I had some competing editorials from Tim Pawlenty, which is a name you probably haven't heard in a long time, and Mike Huckabee about kind of the future of the Republican Party with, Pawlenty pushing that they should moderate and Huckabee pushing basically, well, we should double down as the home for social conservatism. Nothing self-serving in those two taking those positions, whatsoever. Because, Pawlenty saw himself as a front runner if you go the moderate route and Huckabee if you went the other. Whichever route they took, neither one of them ended up being president. So do with that what you will. But that's kind of the rift here that we've got with Democrats right now. You've had a loss. It's you've had a loss, and that leads to some soul searching. You've had some fairly prominent retirements and some forthcoming retirements, some people not seeking reelection, et cetera. And so the party's, I think, to a large degree in flux. I don't know that it's more in flux than an out party ever is, but certainly I think it's got some issues. The big thing to my mind is that it is a party that is extremely old, and sort of to their detriment, something they have really screwed up over the years is, sticking with leadership and frankly incumbents who are just extraordinarily old. And that kind of gives you a bench problem. And this is something that I've said for a long time about Democrats. As Republicans have started doing better at the state level and things like that, you suddenly don't have kind of the bench for presidential elections and stuff that you used to. Setting Trump aside, if we look at where presidents have come from, they always have some sort of government experience, and frequently they're former governors, as we've seen sometimes they're former senators, et cetera. We don't have a lot of those, anymore. And frankly, I think one of the challenges is that, in states where Democrats have done well, Illinois and California in particular, that's not necessarily a label, fairly or not fairly, being labeled as the governor of California or the governor of Illinois. And I say this as a former Illinoisan. It's not something that plays super well, nationwide, necessarily. So, if we're looking for kind of future leadership, problem the Democrats have had just in general is that there has been a lot of, not so many sort of younger figures that have had the chance to sort of come up and sort of, make their case and make their way, et cetera. And I think that is a problem, electorally. The polling that I'm seeing, gosh, the last one I saw, I think, Mayor Pete was up a little bit and Harris was second and, AOC third or something like that. And, I don't know, those are potentially plausible people, I suppose, but it's very early. I would also add at this point in the cycle, in other years, we had Hillary Clinton and Rudy Giuliani as our candidates in the polling. So, a lot can change in the next 3 years.
Yeah, absolutely.
But, there's not a clear leader. And I will say, as somebody who, I am a Democrat, and as I discovered talking to Mike, I'm probably to the left of several of the other Democrats on this show in some ways. But there's a lot of dissatisfaction with the leadership, I think, right now in general. And when it comes to messaging and things like that, I kind of mentioned this on the main show this week. There is one of the things Trump does well is, he throws everything out there to see what sticks, which I think leaves the opposition kind of scrambling to figure out, like, what do you even criticize? What do you focus on, et cetera. But so much of the old guard, as Trump is doing these things that are pissing off the Democratic base, that are even pissing off, some independents and things, they say, well, it's a distraction. We should be talking about the price of eggs and kitchen table issues and things like that. And, I think that's been sort of a mistake. There's not a lot. Jay and I talked about this kind of right after the election. If you have a Republican trifecta, there's not a lot of levers that Democrats have in Congress. And I think they've used at least some of what they have. But certainly what you have is some rhetorical stuff, some messaging. The challenge being that, the president, everything the president says is newsworthy. nobody in Congress necessarily has the bully pulpit in the same way, but you got to get on the same page, and they're largely not. I think in some ways, which has been sort of to their detriment. One thing that keeps popping up. I mean, the Democrats are polling extremely badly in terms of approval of the party, but a lot of that, I mean, hell, as somebody who will probably vote more or less a straight blue ticket in the next two elections, I would probably answer that no, I don't approve of their job either right now, but for different
Right.
for different reasons.
Yeah, right.
And
Right.
those approval questions. You can disapprove on policy, you can disapprove on tactics, you can disapprove on personalities. We never asked the follow up on that, but my general position would be, hey, I approve of them on policy, but quit being candy asses.
As a sports fan, I have to confess, sometimes the game gets kind of boring. That's when I unfold my Samsung Galaxy Z Fold 7 and use multi-window viewing on its large screen. Boring game? I'm checking out my fantasy baseball league at the same time. Score still 1-0? I'm replying to emails in the other window, scoring points with the boss. Semifinals finally getting exciting? I'm buying tickets to the finals and booking my flights. Can your phone do that?
The new Galaxy Z Fold 7. Get yours at Samsung.com.
This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. When you visit the doctor, you probably hand over your insurance, your ID, and contact details. It's just one of the many places that has your personal info. And if any of them accidentally expose it, you could be at risk for identity theft. LifeLock monitors millions of data points a second. If you become a victim, they'll fix it, guaranteed, or your money back. Save up to 40% your first year at LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
Well, as a political scientist and thinking about the 28 horse race, and I know it's early, but on the current gradient for the Dems, is there a historical election? Is there one that you think from just the pure Democratic nomination side, and whether it's going to be someone we're talking about or someone nobody's talking about? Is it going to be a Southern governor, a Midwestern governor, a coastal candidate? Is there an analog going back to like 1968 that you might say that this gradient shapes up most like for the horse race? 88, 72.
Boy, I don't know that
04.
there is.
Okay.
And I think where I would go with that is that I think it could be that region used to be sort of a proxy for ideology. As you sort of look at it, as you sort of look at kind of analogs there, I mean, Bill Clinton was sort of one version of this. He's the Southern Democrat. I know Republicans never saw him this way, but he was, perceived as kind of being more moderate and pitched himself that way. It was kind of this third way sort of Democrat. And, I think that's the fight right now. You mentioned Mamdani in New York, and I think we need to maybe not read too much into that. I mean, that's New York in a fairly low turnout election, but that is sort of the divide. There's sort of a two-way divide, I think, in the Democrats right now, between some version of moderation and something further to the left, as well as there is, kind of there's that divide, but there's also the kind of, rhetorical and sort of, are you going to fight or are you going to roll over angle, which is sort of correlated with that and sort of not. But I feel like we've had, we've talked a little bit about polarization before. It's a different political landscape than past elections in some ways. We are awfully polarized, and that makes it, I think a little hard to find a historical analog. You certainly have a contingent of the party that is focused on centrists. There's sort of two ways to win an election, and you sort of have to do both. But, you need to sort of convert moderates, but you also need to turn out your base. And I think what people tend to forget is that, if you go after one set of voters or the other, you run a risk of sort of dropping your numbers with the other group. And so, I don't see a clear front runner out of that. I think there are also potentially electability concerns, with some of those that voters might have, with Mayor Pete. I know a lot of people like him, but, we've never had a gay candidate, for example, for president. How does that play nationwide?
What's your take on AOC? She's got a lot of star power. So from name recognition, she's obviously a pretty polarizing person. You think if she ran for president, would have a realistic path to potentially getting the nomination?
My gut feeling would be that she would have a hard time making it through the nomination, because I think one thing where Democratic voters may be gun shy is on a female candidate. If you take rightly or wrongly, but people do figure some story of electability in there, and Democrats have lost twice with women. Now, I'm not saying that I don't think you should hold that against them. I voted for both of them, I might add. But, AOC, I think people may look to that and say, gosh, a woman and somebody who's fiery and left, maybe not our first choice. That said, in a general, she is good at doing media. She is at least not mealy-mouthed, and she's out there and pretty bold. And so, I don't know that she is as problematic in a general as people might think. What are your thoughts? You sort of posed the question, obviously we have different goals as far as how things shake out, but I don't know. What do you see this?
Well, just from setting aside what I would like to happen, but just the horse race aspect. This is just pure clinical horse race. I think it's really interesting that you mentioned the bench problem for the Dems. I agree with that. I think there's a huge bench problem. It's one of the great ironic inconsistencies of ostensibly relying on the energy of young people, and then you've just got a few old people holding on to power, non-charitably framed, that the bench is not the same. But in one election, it's really rare that you have both the sitting president, and this is the last election, and the vice president both basically run in the same year. So if you think about like the 1984 election where you had Carter's vice president run, and then the 1988 election where you did not have a national ticket candidate or vice president, it's similar in my mind to that type of an environment, but that all happened in 1 year to the Democratic Party last year in one cycle. And so it creates a dynamic where I think it's as wide open as it was in 88 or as wide open as it was in 04, but the political undertone and gradients have changed, particularly on a fundraising and energy standpoint. And you've got the uber left side that I think is dangerous for the country. And you've got more of the moderates who say, we're not going to win an election like that. And maybe they like it or not. It makes me think there's going to be more Democrats that come over to the Republican Party if they don't think they can, as President Obama said, get tough and stop the more aggressive aspects of their party that some might think are unhealthy for the country, most charitably framed, that honestly I do. That it sets up for a really, really, really interesting primary just from a horse race aspect of it. I just don't know if in the current field of people, I think Josh Shapiro is a talented guy. I query whether a Jewish guy can win the Democratic nomination, but I do think the Democratic Party right now has a Hamas caucus, non-charitably framed, but I do think they do. So I wonder if he could win the nomination. And I don't know I think what the Democratic Party needs right now to be successful is they need another Bill Clinton. I just don't know if he's out there in terms of this next election cycle. I just don't know if he's out there.
We hope you enjoyed this preview of our supporters exclusive midweek show. If you'd like to hear the rest of the episode, we hope you'll consider becoming a supporter. Supporters get ad-free access to all of our shows, membership in our Politics Guys Discord group where you can join in on the conversation, and other benefits at different levels of support. To become a supporter, go to patreon.com/politicsguys. You can also support us through Venmo or @politicsguys or through PayPal. You'll find all of our support links in the show notes as well as at politicsguys.com/support. And if you'd like to get the midweek show, but you're not in a position to become a financial supporter, that's not a problem. Just send me an email at mike@politicsguys.com, and I'll be happy to get that set up for you.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,